SRA 211, Session 3.2.1, The Role of Intelligence in Counterterrorism, Part 1. As we have seen, intelligence operations are a key element of counterterrorism policy. They are one of the policy instruments that are used by counterterrorism officials all over the world. So in this session and the next one, we'll take a look at the role of intelligence in counterterrorism. We'll begin with an examination of the various parts of the so-called intelligence cycle: the establishment of intelligence requirements, what needs to be collected, the actual collection of intelligence, processing of that intelligence where it's necessary, the analysis of that intelligence, which is very important, and then finally the so-called dissemination of the finished intelligence product. Dissemination basically means getting it out to the people who need to see it and use it. In the next session, we'll then focus more closely on the relationship between intelligence and these aspects of intelligence and counterterrorism. The process of intelligence is defined as the various steps or stages that start from when it is decided that something needs to be addressed, a problem needs to be addressed, or some intelligence needs to be collected, analyzed, and it goes through various steps and finishes with the production of ultimately intelligence, finished analytical product. The process is sometimes referred to as the intelligence cycle, and there are a number of different models with different numbers of steps, but basically all models include the establishment of requirements, collection of intelligence, analysis of intelligence, and the dissemination or passing on to the people who need to see it of that intelligence. So what is involved in this intelligence cycle? Well, essentially it's the articulation of intelligence requirements, figuring out what to collect, then to collect it, analyze it, and disseminate it, which means pass it on to the people who need to see it. Ideally information intelligence from multiple sources employing various methods. In the context of counterterrorism, the focus of these activities is on things like the capabilities, activities, and intentions of terrorist groups. Ideally, this information would provide insights into terrorist motivations and thought processes. You should note that the establishment or articulation of intelligence requirements and then the collection, analysis, and dissemination of information are interlocking parts of effective intelligence operations. In a more graphical form, the intelligence cycle would look something like this. At the top are policy-level intelligence requirements. The senior leadership of a country, such as the United States, go out and determine what needs to be collected, what are the priorities. Based on the establishment of those priorities, the next step occurs. The intelligence is actually collected. You'll see here in the lower right there's another step called processing and exploitation. We'll get to that, but that basically means to the extent that the intelligence collected is not in readily user-friendly form, to get it into that form. Then the intelligence needs to be analyzed. Intelligence analysis is a very important element of the cycle. Finally, it gets disseminated to the people who need to see it. In other words, the intelligence gets passed on, sent to military commanders, homeland security officials, and so on. And also the results of that intelligence get passed on up to the political leadership who established the collection requirements in the first place. And then based on what these people then learn from what has all gone on, they may then establish a new set of requirements. And therefore, that's why it's sometimes called a cycle. It keeps feeding into itself. Let's now consider the elements of that intelligence process or intelligence cycle one at a time. The first is the establishment of intelligence requirements. What needs to be collected? What problem needs to be addressed? Every nation has fundamental security and foreign policy interests. Intelligence priorities need to reflect those policy priorities. So the articulation of intelligence requirements means basically defining the policy issues or areas to which intelligence is expected to make a contribution. This includes decisions regarding establishing relative priorities. Issue A is more important this year than issues B and C. It may also involve specifying the collection of certain types of information in specific cases. Not only do we need to focus on issue A, but the way in which we need to collect information is B, C, and D, and so on. Basically, it's establishing the priorities and giving the marching orders to the people who are involved in the intelligence world to go out and do their job. Establishing requirements necessarily involves designating priorities. In many cases, this is done by discussion, dialogue among the various professionals involved in the intelligence world, presenting papers, making arguments. One additional intellectual method of assessing or establishing priorities is to consider two factors regarding a certain event or issue: the likelihood of that event occurring and its relative importance to national security concerns if it does occur. You could see here in the graphic there is a matrix of importance and likelihood. There are four possibilities. An issue or a problem can have high importance, low likelihood, low importance, low likelihood, high importance, high likelihood, and low importance, high likelihood. So obviously look at the upper right of that matrix. Something that is very important and very likely to happen obviously gets a lot of attention. Right? The development of a nuclear program by Iran or North Korea, for example. These countries are continuing to work on their nuclear programs is very likely. And it is obvious that this is also very important. So this gets highly prioritized. At the other end, low importance and low likelihood. Something is not very likely to happen, and if it does, it's really not going to be that important. You can imagine that that gets relatively little attention from the intelligence community, the professionals who work on intelligence matters. Let's go to the bottom right. Low importance and high likelihood. That's something that's probably going to happen very likely, but we're not going to care that much about it if it does. For example, for a long time in the decades past, there were governments changing in Italy every few months, it seemed. A government would fall and another government would be established. It was a very high likelihood event. But each of those governments basically maintained the same foreign policy, the same stance with respect to the United States. So therefore, it really didn't matter what government came into power in Italy. So it was a high likelihood but low importance event. Didn't get a lot of attention. That leaves the box on the upper left, and that is the one where intelligence professionals really earn their pay. That's something that is not very likely to happen, but if it does happen, it's going to be really, really, really important. And sort of predicting and figuring out what these are in advance, that's usually the million-dollar question. Things like predicting a major terrorist attack, which is not likely, but very important when it happens. Predicting and analyzing the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. That would have been an example of something with a low likelihood. A lot of people never thought the Soviet Union would collapse, but very important when it did happen. So these issues sometimes don't get as much attention as they should, but they can be crucially important. Now, so far this all sounds very scientific, but there can be problems in agreeing on this. Problems can arise when there's a lack of clarity concerning likelihood. People are debating whether or not something really is likely or not. Or there can also be a debate about the importance. People can disagree. But keep in mind that this is just one tool that's also used to assess relative priorities. Once priorities have been established and requirements have been set, the next step is for the professionals who are involved in intelligence collection to go out and collect the intelligence. There's a long history of intelligence collection. It's happened since ancient times. And without collection, intelligence is guesswork. You have to have some concrete facts that you've collected. Now, the United States and most, or at least some other nations, use multiple means of collecting intelligence. Usually, the way you go after intelligence is related to the type of thing you're trying to get your hands on. We'll see what that means in a minute. In the United States, these various means of collection are known as intelligence collection disciplines. They're also known informally as the INTs. It's generally accepted that there are 5 basic types of intelligence collection methods. There can be, people can argue there are more or less, but let's take these 5. There's geospatial intelligence, also called GeoInt, essentially the collection of photographic or any other type of imagery. There is signals intelligence, or SIGINT. This is the collection of all types of wire and wireless electronic signals and communications. There's a type of collection called measurement and signatures intelligence, MASINT. This is a variety of scientific, technical intelligence collection means. Of course, there is old-fashioned human intelligence, or something called HUMINT. This is espionage carried out in person by human beings. And then finally, a relatively new addition to the world of intelligence collection, open source intelligence, or OSINT. Now, some question whether anything that's open source can ever be valuable intelligence. But as you can probably imagine, in today's world where there's so much information available, if you can devote resources to collating and analyzing and trying to make sense and piecing together different bits of things that are in the open source, you can sometimes get very, very useful intelligence. Also in the context of counterterrorism. So open source is pretty obvious what that is. Not much more needs to be said about that. Let's take a closer look at the other 4 individually. We will start with geospatial intelligence. The focus of GeoInt is in fact on imagery. For a time it was actually called imagery intelligence, or IMINT. Now the imagery may be of various types. It may be what's called electro-optical, produced by optical systems similar to images produced by cameras, high-altitude spy planes, satellites taking imagery. These days, imagery can also be digital, that's transmitted as a data stream that are then reconstructed. Imagery can be radar images, pulses of radio waves that are reflected back to the sender, or infrared images that are images based on the surface heat reflected. Radar and infrared imagery sort of blend into the discipline called MASINT, but they're usually included in geospatial intelligence. Radar is very useful because it's not dependent on light. It's quite effective in bad weather and at night. Infrared, likewise, can detect warm objects even under cover. So you sometimes have seen police photos of fugitives running and trying to hide, and you could see the warmth of an infrared image of their body heat, things like that. So this is all, these are all various types of imagery that are important and together constitute geospatial intelligence. The second major discipline of intelligence collection is called signals intelligence, usually defined as the interception by electronic or electroacoustic means of communications between 2 parties. It used to be called communications intelligence, COMINT. Note that 2 parties don't need to be 2 human beings. They usually are 2 human beings, especially in the counterterrorism context. But communications can be communications between a satellite tracking station and a satellite, communications between a missile control center and a missile, and so on. Communication between two computers. SIGINT, or signals intelligence, can often provide very useful intelligence because the ability to intercept communications surreptitiously, that means secretly, can sometimes provide insight into what is being said, planned, and considered by an adversary. So unlike geospatial intelligence, which essentially provides a picture or a snapshot of something, signals intelligence can sometimes shed light onto the intent of an actor, such as a terrorist group. Now, you could say that GeoInt can also shed light on intent. If photographic evidence shows a massive army massed on another country's border, that can show an intent to invade. That's true, but not to the extent that signals intelligence can. What terrorists are saying to each other when they think that nobody's listening can provide very useful intelligence as to their intentions. The next intelligence discipline is called Measurement and Signatures Intelligence, or MASINT, a variety of technical intelligence means. Now, this probably has less relevance for counterterrorism, but it is one of the classic intelligence disciplines and therefore merits mentioning here. The focus of MASINT and the various MASINT measures, and there are a bunch of them, are on weapons capabilities and industrial activities. So MASINT was used in the Cold War when these fluids flowing out of a Soviet chemical plant were analyzed to try to determine whether they were making chemical weapons. Missile tests that cause disturbances in the atmosphere can be analyzed to see what type of missile is being fired and things like that. To a certain extent, some of the elements of MASINT can be viewed as a product of signals intelligence. It really is its own discipline and very important in the context of trying to detect the development of weapons of mass destruction. Finally, there's old-fashioned human intelligence, or HUMINT, classic espionage. Very important in the counterterrorism context. In fact, one of the perceived shortcomings of U.S. efforts to get information about terrorists in the wake of the 9/11 attacks was that we didn't do enough in terms of human intelligence. HUMINT most often involves the sending of clandestine intelligence officers to foreign countries, who then go out and recruit foreign nationals to conduct espionage. Intelligence officers may also engage in direct spying, such as stealing of documents and so on. But by and large, when you hear about an intelligence agent in the United States context, the agent is not the U.S. intelligence officer. The agent is a foreign national who has been recruited by the intelligence officer. In the United States, human intelligence is largely the responsibility of the Central Intelligence Agency, and it's carried out by the Directorate of Operations. Most of you are very familiar with what espionage means, so it probably doesn't need much more explanation here. So these last slides involved the various means of collection. Once intelligence is collected, it may be able to be passed right on to the analysts for analysis, but sometimes it's not. Now, most written reports from agents or foreign governments can go directly to the analysis part of the intelligence operation. But sometimes there's technical intelligence that really doesn't arrive in user-friendly or ready-to-use form. Sometimes written reports need to be translated. Various types of imagery, signals intelligence, measurements, and test data, the more scientific stuff, must routinely be processed from complex digital signals or other formats into different types of viewable images for the analysts. Remember, the analysts are often not very technical people. They are the liberal arts majors who are working in the CIA and elsewhere who just make connections among the various bits of intelligence that they are given and make sense out of it. So in some cases, it needs the intelligence before it goes to the analysts needs processing and exploitation. So after it's processed, if it needed to be processed, the collected intelligence goes to the analysts. And these are the people who try to make sense of it. They try to connect the dots, separate important signals from background noise. In the context of counterterrorism, there are additional challenges in dealing with these non-state adversaries with so-called asymmetric threats. It's one thing to analyze intelligence about a big country like the former Soviet Union, a little bit more challenging when you're dealing with very small groups that have a much smaller footprint, like terrorist organizations. There are various components to analyzing intelligence. You look for patterns of communication, interpret what images mean. Very important is assessing the reliability of sources, corroborating evidence and analysis or intelligence with other bits of intelligence. And then finally, evaluating the significance of data by cross-referencing and triangulation, meaning leveraging bits of information that you do have or analysis that has been completed and using that to develop even more good analysis. The final step in the intelligence process is the dissemination of the finished intelligence. Once again, dissemination is a government-type word that means passing it on to the people who need to see it. The intelligence collected and the good analysis provided doesn't mean anything if the finished product is not transmitted to the people who need to see it. Military commanders in the field, Homeland Security officials. And as previously stated, the finished intelligence also goes back up the line to the senior officials who started the whole process initially, and based on what they now learn, based on what has been collected and analyzed, there may be some new requirements generated, and that's how the intelligence cycle starts all over again. So these are the basic elements of the intelligence cycle. In the next session, we'll take a closer look at how these can be applied to the world of terrorism.